Before the Bugatti Veyron, there was this, the 241-mile-an-hour McLaren F1. Despite its similar top speed, the McLaren F1 is the very opposite of the Veyron. No turbochargers, no four-wheel drive, no traction control, no ABS, and no flappy paddle electronically controlled gearbox. In spirit, the McLaren is closer to a Caterham than a Bugatti. A Caterham with a gold-plated engine compartment. It was built without compromise, and nothing was to get in the way of the driving experience. That's why the driver sits in the middle, so they feel completely in control. McLaren was so determined to use this layout, they even had the law changed to make it possible. Then there's the 627 brake horsepower 6.1-litre V12 engine, built specially for this car by a crack team of BMW motorsport engineers, and the bespoke gearbox and a body made of carbon fibre. We take that for granted in supercars now, but back in the early 90s, it was so extraordinary they might as well have made it from lumps of Jupiter. Personally, I've never cared that much for the F1. It was too twitchy. But without it, Bugatti wouldn't have had something to aim for, and we wouldn't have had the incredible Veyron. In that respect, we owe McLaren our thanks.
People look back on the F1 and say, you know, it was a very clever car because it was the first carbon car, but actually it wasn't really. It was just Formula One technology, purely Formula One technology applied to a road car. So the monocoque and the body on the F1 was identical to current Formula One cars in the early 90s. Before I did the F1, I drove all the current crop of supercars. Really what I did was try and exorcise the bad things that supercars were well known for. One of those is pedal offsets, and one of the main reasons for doing the central driving position was to get rid of all those horrible offsets that you had in current supercars. But another reason for the central driving position was to make somebody feel very special. This was going to be the world's first sort of $1 million car. We didn't know it at the time, but knew it was going to be expensive. So I wanted the driver to feel special, and sitting in the middle was synonymous with Formula One. Aerodynamics has always been at the front of my mind, and having no rules in road cars, it's actually more exciting, if you like, than racing cars. So we were able to have rear wings that popped up and down. We had active brake cooling ducts that opened and shut when the brakes needed cooling. And of course it was the world's first ground effect road car. I didn't set myself any performance targets. I know people, you know, look at the top speed and say we must have, but actually we didn't. But of course, being a racing car designer, subconsciously you do everything as you would on a racing car. So the car turned out to be very light and very stiff and very efficient. And with the power we had available, it just turned out to be an extremely high performance car which set new standards. The other part of performance of the F1, of course, is the speed. It's got a very small frontal area. If you look at it in terms of today's supercars, it's got a very low drag coefficient. The big unknown, of course, is the F1 has ram intake pressure, just like a Formula One car. It's a top airbox, effectively. Very direct. I mean, if you took the air filter out, you can see the inlet valves. That's how direct it is. And we didn't know how much that was going to give us. So when we went to Air Relation and did the final top speed run with Andy Wallace, with the extra ram effect we had from the engine, we ran into the rev limiter. So we had to disconnect the rev limiter to do the 240 miles an hour. It's still, I think, the quickest normally aspirated car on the planet. When I set out to do the F1, I just tried to do the best car I could from an engineering point of view. You have no concept and no idea at all if the car's ever going to turn out to be a classic, collectible, or even iconic motor car. The fact that it has, and now 25 years on, we have the McLaren F1 with the status it has, makes me feel very good, honestly. It makes me feel very proud about what we all achieved.
They fall into various categories, actually. If you start with the obvious, which is the styling. I mean, I knew what I wanted from day one with the F1, the shape and the purity and the timeless and all that stuff. But in those days, we worked in clay, and we signed off in clay, and you can't really see highlights that well in clay. So by the time you got to sign off the full-size clay model, the next time you saw it, it was cut out of tuning block. And when you get to that stage, you can really only get wet and dry and move highlights a little bit. You can't change it. And there were things I really didn't like. The one that drives me insane every time I see one is the spine's too wide for the width of the car. It's about 50 mil too wide. Yep. And every time I see one, I shudder. You know? And the other thing is, I wanted a bit more shape across the rear deck, and it just came out a bit flat. We've only got this little crease here. Yeah. I wanted this to be a bit more muscular. Yep.
Bit more curve from the wheel arch down.
Bit more power in this bit. Those are the main things really on the styling. And then there were certain things on the F1 which were rubbish, really. It just didn't work. Headlamps. Yeah. Headlamps were like glowworms in a jar.
This is technology of the day.
But it wasn't just that. To save money, I just bought standard lamp units. Yep. The rear ones were from the Veco truck, and the front ones were Halfords or something. Yep. And they were glowworms in a jar. I mean, you couldn't see anything over 100 miles an hour. So
air conditioning?
Aircon didn't work at all, for two reasons. One was that the compressor on the engine had to survive at 8,000, so it idled. It wasn't doing very much. But the one thing I got wrong was the cabin exit air, which comes out of here. The exit valve is probably a third of the cross-sectional area it needs to be. I just couldn't fit a bigger one in. So I managed to fix all that on the new one.
Well, to say brakes as well. I mean, famously, you went with steerings instead of carbon.
Brakes were okay. They had good modulation, but you had to push quite hard. And the reason for that is you have to sign the car off with repeated stops from 90% Vmax, which in our case was over 200 miles an hour. And the pads are so hard to resist that. They annoyingly squeak all the time. Although that becomes a bit of an F1 thing if you own one. You know, you want the brakes to squeak.
Shows you've been using it.
If we'd put softer pads in, it wouldn't have been legal, but the brake pedal would have felt a lot better and the performance would have been a lot better.
But these were sort of limitations of the technology of the day, right? You're working around these things.
And then there was loading the luggage. This pops out against your legs. It's hinged along the bottom line. And fitting the suitcases in through that triangle was always a bit of
down and in, isn't it?
It was a bit of a pain, to be honest. Interior stowage wasn't enough, really, for a proper GT motor car. And then on the maintenance side, the clutch needed adjusting, depending on how good or bad a driver you were. Clutch needed adjusting every 5,000 to 15,000 miles, which owners hated. The fuel tank was a bag tank, which was a big mistake, because every 5 years you had to take the bag out, which meant engine out. And there were things like that. So, you know, all those things stuck in my head. And
percolated for several decades.
And they just sat there as a list. And I knew if I did another one day, I could fix them all.